This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Winter's icy grip held tight in the small, isolated town of Starkfield, Massachusetts. It was here that Ethan Frome, a young man barely into his 20s, found himself shouldering the heavy burden of caring for his ailing mother. The biting wind howled through the bare trees, rattling the shutters of the old Frome farmhouse. Ethan stood at the frost-covered window, his breath fogging the glass as he gazed out at the snow-blanketed fields. The farm, once a symbol of prosperity, now lay dormant under winter's harsh blanket. The old barn creaked and groaned, its timbers protesting against the relentless cold. Ethan's dreams of becoming an engineer felt as distant as the spring flowers buried beneath the snow. Each morning, he rose before dawn, his muscles aching from the previous day's labor. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way to the kitchen, the chill seeping through his worn socks. He stoked the fire, the warmth a fleeting comfort against the cold that seemed to live in his bones. The routine was always the same: tend to the animals, their breath visible in the frigid air of the barn. Attempt to salvage what he could of the farm, his fingers numb as he worked, and care for his mother whose frail form seemed to shrink further into her bed with each passing day. The sound of her labored breathing filled the quiet house, a constant reminder of the weight on Ethan's young shoulders. The arrival of Zenobia Pierce was like a sudden thaw in the midst of winter. She swept into their lives with the briskness of a north wind, her efficiency a stark contrast to the lethargy that had settled over the Frome household. Ethan watched in awe as she managed tasks with practiced ease, her capable hands bringing order to their chaotic world. At first, Ethan felt grateful for the help, relief washing over him like a warm breeze. Yet as the days wore on, he found himself increasingly reliant on her presence. She became his anchor in a world that felt increasingly unstable, like a sapling bending towards the sun for survival. As winter tightened its grip, so too did illness tighten its hold on Ethan's mother. The house filled with the sound of whispered prayers and the acrid smell of medicinal tinctures. Ethan spent long nights by her bedside, his calloused hand clasped in her frail one, feeling the life slowly ebb away. When she finally passed, it was as if the last warmth had been leached from the world, leaving Ethan adrift in a sea of grief and loneliness. The farm, once his burden, now felt like an anchor threatening to drag him down into the depths of despair. Zenobia remained a steady presence amidst the turmoil of Ethan's emotions. In her practicality, he saw a lifeline, a chance to cling to something solid in a world that had become frighteningly uncertain. It was this desperation, this overwhelming need for stability, that drove Ethan to make a decision that would alter the course of his life. One evening, as the last light of day faded and shadows crept across the worn floorboards of the farmhouse, Ethan turned to Zenobia. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, as he forced out the words that felt foreign on his tongue, asking for her hand in marriage. The proposal hung in the air like frost, delicate and sharp. Zenobia's eyes, calculating and cool, met Ethan's. In his offer, she saw not a declaration of love, but an opportunity for security. Her acceptance was as pragmatic as the woman herself, devoid of the passion one might expect in such a moment. Their wedding was a somber affair, more akin to a funeral than a celebration of union. The few guests who attended spoke in hushed tones, their words muffled by the heavy atmosphere that blanketed the proceedings like fresh snow. Ethan and Zenobia stood side by side, their hands joined but their hearts separated by an invisible chasm of unspoken expectations and resigned acceptance. As they began their life together, the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy quilt, smothering any hope of warmth or affection. Ethan, looking at his new bride, felt the full weight of his decision. He had traded one form of duty for another, and as the first night of their marriage approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow sealed his fate. Ethan stood at the window once more, staring out at the farm that had once been his family's pride. The paint peeled from the weathered clapboards, and the sagging roof seemed to mirror the weight of despair that had settled over its inhabitants. As darkness fell, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, had he made the right choice, or had he just condemned himself to a life as barren and unyielding as the winter landscape that surrounded them. The Frome farm, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now stood as a testament to the relentless march of time and misfortune. The paint peeled from the weathered clapboards, and the sagging roof seemed to mirror the weight of despair that had settled over its inhabitants. Inside, the air hung heavy with the acrid scent of illness and resignation. Zeena, as Zenobia was now called, had transformed from a capable, strong-willed woman into a shadow of her former self. Her body, once sturdy and resilient, now lay frail and wasted beneath a mound of quilts. The bedroom, which had once echoed with whispered promises and gentle laughter, now resonated with the harsh rasp of labored breathing and bitter complaints. Ethan moved through the house like a ghost, his footsteps heavy with the burden of responsibility. The farm demanded constant attention, a hungry beast that consumed his every waking moment. Yet even as he toiled from dawn to dusk, he felt the crushing weight of failure pressing down upon him. The fields yielded less with each passing season, and the livestock grew thin and sickly. One evening, as the wind howled like a mournful banshee around the eaves of the farmhouse, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. The silence was shattered by Zeena's reedy voice, drifting down from the bedroom upstairs. "Ethan! Ethan, come here. I need to talk to you." With a weary sigh, he hauled himself to his feet and trudged up the creaking stairs. Zeena's sunken eyes fixed upon him as he entered the dimly lit room. "We need help, Ethan," she declared, her words punctuated by a rattling cough. "I can't manage anymore. What about my young cousin, Mattie Silver? She's an orphan with nowhere else to go." Ethan nodded, too worn down to argue. The prospect of another mouth to feed should have filled him with dread, but instead he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Mattie's arrival was like the first warm breeze of spring after a long, bitter winter. She swept into the farmhouse, her arms laden with bags and her face alight with a smile that seemed to chase away the shadows. The stale air stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and possibility. From the moment she crossed the threshold, Ethan felt a shift in the atmosphere. Mattie's laughter, light and melodious, filled the once silent rooms. Her small, deft hands brought order to the chaos that had slowly crept into every corner of their lives. Fresh curtains appeared at the windows, their cheerful patterns a stark contrast to the faded, threadbare ones that had hung there for years. Vases of wildflowers sprouted on tables, their bright petals a reminder of the beauty that still existed beyond the oppressive walls of the farmhouse. Mealtimes, once silent affairs punctuated only by the scraping of utensils on plates, became moments Ethan found himself looking forward to. Mattie's lively chatter filled the air, her stories and observations bringing a spark of the outside world into their isolated existence. Ethan caught himself smiling more, the deep furrows of worry on his face softening in Mattie's presence. As days melted into weeks, Ethan became increasingly aware of Mattie's presence. The swish of her skirts as she moved about the house, the scent of lavender that seemed to linger wherever she had been. He found his eyes following her as she worked, admiring the grace of her movements, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over her tasks. A warmth he had long forgotten began to stir in his chest, like embers rekindling after years of neglect. But even as life seemed to breathe anew into the farmhouse, a darker current ran beneath the surface. Zeena, from her sickbed, watched the changes with narrowed eyes. Her gaze, once merely dull with pain and fatigue, now held a glimmer of something more sinister. Suspicion, perhaps, or a deep-seated resentment. She observed Mattie and Ethan with a hawk-like intensity, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. The atmosphere in the house, which had briefly lightened with Mattie's arrival, began to feel charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Ethan found himself caught between two worlds, the gloomy, oppressive reality of his life with Zeena, and the tantalizing glimpse of what could be, represented by Mattie's youth and vitality. The contrast was as stark as night and day, leaving him increasingly torn and conflicted. As autumn's crisp air gave way to winter's icy breath, Ethan felt a change stirring within him. The bitter cold that seeped through the farmhouse's walls seemed to heighten his awareness of Mattie's warmth. Her cheerful presence became a beacon in the long, dark nights, drawing him like a moth to a flame. With each passing day, he found himself lingering longer in her company, savoring the light she brought into his world. But as the snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this newfound happiness was as fragile as a delicate icicle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The seasons shifted from crisp autumn to bitter winter. As the world around him changed, Ethan found himself increasingly drawn to Mattie's warmth and cheerfulness. The young woman's presence in his home was like a flickering candle, casting a soft glow that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness of his dreary existence. Ethan began inventing reasons to spend time with Mattie, his heart racing each time he approached her. The rough skin of his work-worn hands tingled as he guided her smaller, softer ones through household tasks. Together they kneaded bread dough, the rhythmic motion a dance of shared intimacy. When mending torn clothing, their fingers would brush, sending sparks of electricity through Ethan's body. On errands to town, Ethan found himself taking the long way home, relishing every moment of their shared laughter and easy conversation. The crunch of snow beneath their feet and the jingle of sleigh bells provided a soundtrack to their growing connection. Mattie's cheeks, flushed from the cold, seemed to glow with an inner light that drew Ethan like a moth to a flame. The stark contrast between Mattie's youthful enthusiasm and Zeena's constant complaints grew more pronounced in Ethan's mind with each passing day. Zeena's voice grated on his nerves like the harsh winter wind whistling through bare tree branches, while Mattie's melodious tones soothed him like a gentle spring breeze carrying the promise of new beginnings. As snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the world into a glittering wonderland, Ethan found himself looking forward to the town's social gatherings with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. The dances, once a tedious obligation, now held the promise of stolen moments with Mattie. Under the vast canopy of stars, he'd walk her home, their breaths mingling in the frosty air, creating ephemeral clouds that dissipated like his dreams of a different life. These brief moments alone became precious to Ethan, each one a treasure he'd turn over in his mind during the long, lonely hours in the fields or the sawmill. The monotonous whir of the saw became a backdrop to his daydreams, where he'd replay Mattie's tinkling laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the soft brush of her arm against his as they walked side by side. In these reveries, he allowed himself to imagine a life filled with the joy and companionship Mattie represented, a life so different from the gray existence he shared with Zeena. Mattie, too, began to show signs of reciprocating Ethan's affection. A rosy blush would creep up her neck and bloom across her cheeks at his compliments, like the first flowers of spring pushing through the snow. She'd linger in conversation, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing every line in plain. When Ethan entered a room, Mattie seemed to brighten, as if she were a sunflower turning toward the light, her very being reaching out to him. Their growing closeness manifested in small gestures that spoke volumes in the quiet of their repressed emotions. A lingering glance across the dinner table, heavy with unspoken words. The brush of hands while passing dishes, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. A shared laugh over a private joke. A moment of connection in a world that sought to keep them apart. Yet for all the joy these moments brought, they also carried the weight of mounting guilt. Ethan's sense of duty to Zeena hung around his neck like a millstone, threatening to drag him under. The constraints of their small, conservative community pressed in on him from all sides, a cage of expectations and obligations that left no room for the wild beating of his heart. As winter deepened, so too did the emotional tension in the household. It built slowly, like ice forming on a pond, layer by layer, until the surface was thick enough to walk on but treacherous enough to crack at any moment. Ethan struggled with his growing love for Mattie, a feeling as vast and uncontrollable as the night sky, and his obligations to his wife, as immovable as the mountains that surrounded their farm. The atmosphere in the house became charged with unspoken desires and simmering resentments. Zeena's suspicious glances, sharp and cold as icicles, pierced through the warmth Ethan felt in Mattie's presence. Mattie's wistful sighs, soft as snowflakes, settled on Ethan's conscience, adding to the weight of his internal turmoil. Each interaction was fraught with hidden meanings, every silence pregnant with words left unsaid. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Ethan found himself standing at a crossroads, torn between the life he had and the life he longed for. The emotional tension in the household continued to build, an invisible force as palpable as the winter chill, creating an atmosphere charged with unspoken desires and mounting guilt. One evening, as the wind howled outside and shadows danced on the walls, Ethan caught Mattie's eye across the room. In that moment, something shifted, like the ground trembling before an avalanche. He opened his mouth to speak, his heart pounding in his chest, when suddenly the farmhouse creaked and groaned under the weight of winter's chill. The sound seemed to echo the tension that had settled over its inhabitants, and Ethan turned to see Zeena sitting in her rocking chair, her bony fingers clutching a worn shawl, her eyes darting between him and Mattie like a hawk tracking its prey. The farmhouse creaked and groaned under the weight of winter's chill, mirroring the tension that had settled over its inhabitants. Zeena sat in her rocking chair, her bony fingers clutching a worn shawl, her eyes darting between Ethan and Mattie like a hawk tracking its prey. Ethan's gaze lingered on Mattie as she moved about the kitchen, her presence a warm contrast to the bitter cold outside. His voice softened when he spoke to her, a gentleness that had long been absent from his conversations with Zeena. Mattie seemed to glow in his presence, her cheeks flushed with more than just the heat from the stove. Zeena's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding together as she watched their silent dance. Her ailments intensified with her growing suspicions, her complaints becoming more frequent and demanding. The sound of Ethan and Mattie's muffled laughter from the kitchen below was like sandpaper on her nerves. "Ethan!" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "I need my medicine!" The laughter downstairs abruptly ceased, replaced by the hurried shuffling of feet. Zeena's lips curled into a bitter smile. As days passed, Mattie's housework fell under constant scrutiny. Zeena's eyes narrowed at every speck of dust, every slightly crooked picture frame. "I suppose this is what passes for clean these days," she muttered, her words hanging in the air like icicles. The atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension, like fog rolling in from the fields. Ethan and Mattie became more cautious, their interactions stilted and guarded under Zeena's watchful gaze. They moved about the house like mice trying to avoid a cat's paw, always aware of their unseen but ever-present observer. Zeena, her face a mask of pain both real and imagined, began to reminisce about the early days of her marriage. Her words dripped with honey-coated venom as she reminded Ethan of his duties and obligations. "Do you remember, Ethan," she'd say, her voice deceptively soft, "how you promised to care for me, in sickness and in health?" Each reminder was another link in the chain that bound him to her, to this life of quiet desperation. Her visits to various doctors increased, each return bringing new diagnoses and treatments that drained not only Ethan's attention, but also their meager resources. The medicine bottles multiplied on the bedside table, a growing army in Zeena's war against her perceived enemies. Zeena's attempts to reassert control over the household became more overt. She'd rearrange furniture on a whim, criticize meals with a curl of her lip, and make sudden changes to the daily routine that left both Ethan and Mattie scrambling to adjust. "We'll have dinner at 4 now," she announced one day, just as Mattie was setting the table for their usual 6 o'clock meal. "I find I can't stomach food so late anymore." The tension between all three became a living, breathing entity in the house. It lurked in the shadows, coiled in the corners, ready to spring at the slightest provocation. Ethan found himself caught in an impossible position, torn between his growing feelings for Mattie, feelings that bloomed like wildflowers in his heart, and his sense of duty to Zeena, a duty that weighed on him like a millstone around his neck. Mattie, for her part, struggled to navigate her position in the increasingly strained household. She walked a tightrope, trying to balance her affection for Ethan, her gratitude to Zeena for taking her in, and her own desires for happiness and belonging. Each day became a test of her resolve, her smile a mask that grew harder to maintain. As winter tightened its grip on the farm, so too did the unspoken conflict tighten its hold on the three inhabitants. They moved through their days like actors in a tragic play, each aware of their role but powerless to change the script. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Zeena's eyes gleamed with a sudden, unsettling light. She cleared her throat, drawing the attention of both Ethan and Mattie. The air in the room seemed to still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Zeena made a sudden announcement. She declared her intention to travel to a neighboring town to consult a new doctor about her worsening condition. The news hung in the air like a fragile bubble, leaving Ethan and Mattie facing the prospect of an evening alone together. It was a rare occurrence that filled them both with a heady mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself distracted at work, his mind constantly drifting to thoughts of the evening ahead. The rhythmic clanging of tools against wood seemed to mock him, each sound a reminder of the slowly passing time. The hours crawled by like molasses in winter, each tick of the clock echoing his growing impatience. When Ethan finally made his way home, the setting sun painted the sky in a riot of colors. Streaks of orange and pink stretched across the horizon, as if nature itself was celebrating the promise of the night to come. The crisp air nipped at his cheeks, but Ethan barely noticed, his mind already racing ahead to the warmth waiting for him inside. Stepping into the kitchen, Ethan was greeted by a sight that made his heart skip a beat. Mattie had transformed the usually drab room into a warm, inviting space. The air was thick with the aroma of a special supper she had prepared, the scent a stark contrast to the usual bland meals served under Zeena's watchful eye. It smelled of hope and possibility, of dreams long suppressed finally given room to breathe. The kitchen glowed with soft lamplight, casting dancing shadows on the walls like playful spirits. Mattie stood by the stove, her cheeks flushed from the heat and perhaps something more. Her eyes sparkled as she greeted Ethan, a smile playing on her lips that seemed to light up the room more than any lamp could. In that moment, she was a vision of everything he had ever wanted but never dared to reach for. As they sat down to eat, the usual heavy silence that hung over the house like a shroud was replaced by easy conversation and laughter. Their words flowed freely, unencumbered by the fear of Zeena's disapproving presence. It was as if they were different people, versions of themselves that only existed in each other's company. The clink of cutlery against plates punctuated their shared jokes and stories, creating a melody of contentment. In a moment of daring, or perhaps recklessness born from their newfound freedom, Mattie decided to use Zeena's prized red pickle dish. The dish, a wedding gift rarely removed from its place of honor, gleamed on the table like a ruby. Its presence added to the feeling that this was no ordinary evening, but something precious and forbidden. As they cleared the table, still caught up in the warmth of their shared meal, disaster struck with the swiftness of a summer storm. The family cat, startled by a noise from outside, leapt onto the table. In a heart-stopping moment, its paw caught the edge of the pickle dish, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass seemed to echo through the empty house, a jarring reminder of the world beyond their brief moment of happiness. It was like a thunderclap breaking through a perfect summer day. Ethan and Mattie stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The symbolism of their transgression hit them both at once, the broken dish a physical manifestation of their guilt. With shaking hands and pounding hearts, they knelt on the cold floor, desperately trying to piece the dish back together. Their fingers fumbled with the tiny shards, each one a painful reminder of the fragility of their situation. Despite their frantic efforts, the cracks remained visible, like fault lines running through the foundation of their lives. As they carefully placed the mended dish back in its rightful place, a heavy silence fell between them. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, as tangible as the winter snow outside. They both knew, without speaking a word, that things could never be the same. The broken pickle dish stood as a silent witness to their forbidden feelings, a constant reminder of the irreparable damage done to Ethan's marriage and their own innocence. The clock on the mantel chimed, startling them both. Its steady ticking seemed to grow louder with each passing second, a relentless reminder that their stolen moment was coming to an end. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to offer some words of comfort or reassurance, but found himself at a loss. What could he possibly say to make this right? Just then, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized what it meant. He turned to Mattie, seeing his own panic reflected in her wide eyes. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But there was no mistaking the familiar creak of the gate, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Zeena had returned far earlier than expected. As the door handle began to turn, Ethan and Mattie exchanged one last, desperate look, knowing that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Zeena returned from her doctor's visit earlier than expected. Her mood, already sour, had darkened even further during her journey. The old farmhouse seemed to shrink as she approached, its weathered boards creaking in protest. A gust of wind whipped around her, carrying the scent of impending snow and stirring the dead leaves at her feet. As she stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under her weight, announcing her arrival like a death knell. The warmth of the house did nothing to thaw the ice in her veins. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room, taking in every detail with predatory focus. Ethan and Mattie froze, their faces draining of color. The air grew thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Zeena's gaze flickered between them, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. "Where's my pickle dish?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I need it for something special." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mattie stood stock still, her eyes wide with fear. With deliberate slowness, Zeena made her way to the china cabinet. Her bony fingers traced the outline of the poorly mended dish, each touch a silent accusation. The room held its breath as she lifted it, examining it with the intensity of a judge weighing a death sentence. "What happened to my dish?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Ethan fumbled for words, his excuses sounding hollow and pathetic. "It was an accident," he stammered. "We didn't mean to." Zeena cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. Her fury when it came was not a storm of rage, but a glacier of cold, calculated anger. "I've decided to dismiss Mattie," she announced, her words falling like hammer blows. "My new treatment requires a more efficient housekeeper. I've already arranged for a new girl to arrive tomorrow." The news hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. He felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him, leaving him suspended in a void of despair. "But Mattie's been a great help," he argued, his voice tinged with desperation. Changing help now would be so disruptive. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Zeena stood unmoved, a statue of cold resolve. With clinical detachment, she outlined her plans, each word another nail in the coffin of Ethan and Mattie's hopes. "You'll take Mattie to the train station tomorrow," Zeena declared, her tone brooking no argument. The atmosphere in the house grew unbearably heavy, as if the very walls were closing in around them. Ethan felt trapped, caught between his duty to his wife and the overwhelming feelings he harbored for Mattie. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, a means to change Zeena's mind, or at least delay the inevitable. Mattie moved like a sleepwalker to begin packing her meager belongings. Each item she placed in her bag seemed to represent a shattered dream, a future that would never come to pass. The soft rustle of fabric and the muffled thud of books being packed were the only sounds in the oppressive silence. Zeena watched the proceedings with a mixture of triumph and bitterness etched on her face. Her victory brought her little joy, serving only to deepen the lines of discontent around her mouth. She sat rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if already envisioning a future without Mattie's presence. As night fell, darkness crept into the Frome household like a living thing, bringing with it a suffocating silence. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison to its occupants. The tick of the clock on the mantel seemed to grow louder with each passing second, a relentless reminder of the dwindling time. Ethan lay awake, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and half-formed plans. The moonlight filtering through the window cast eerie shadows on the wall, shapes that seemed to mock his helplessness. Mattie's soft sobs echoed faintly through the thin walls, each quiet gasp a dagger to his heart. As the night wore on, a plan began to form in Ethan's mind. It was desperate, perhaps even foolish, but it was all he had. He would take Mattie to the train station as Zeena had ordered, but then, his heart raced at the thought of what might come next. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But for the occupants of the Frome household, it brought no warmth, no hope. Only the cold certainty that everything was about to change. As Ethan rose to face the day, a sense of grim determination settled over him. He cast one last look at the house, knowing that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The air seemed charged with possibility and danger as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, ready to set his plan in motion. Melancholy hung heavy in the air on Mattie's last evening in the Frome household. The farm, once a place of quiet contentment, now echoed with the impending loss of her presence. The creaking floorboards seemed to groan under the weight of unspoken regret, and even the flickering lamplight cast long, mournful shadows across the worn walls. Zeena's voice, thin and reedy, drifted down from upstairs like a ghostly whisper. "I'm not feeling well. I'll be retiring early." The words fell like pebbles into a still pond, sending ripples of tension through the already strained atmosphere. Ethan and Mattie exchanged a glance, a mixture of relief and guilt passing between them like a silent current. As Zeena's footsteps faded, leaving behind a trail of creaking wood, Ethan and Mattie found themselves alone in the kitchen. The room, usually a haven of warmth and subtle joy during Mattie's stay, now felt as confining as a birdcage. The tick of the old clock on the mantel seemed to count down their precious remaining moments, each second slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Mattie moved about the kitchen, her usual grace replaced by a hesitant, almost reluctant motion. Her hands, once so sure in their tasks, now trembled slightly as she prepared their final meal together. The soft clink of pots and pans seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the silence. Ethan watched her, drinking in every detail. The way her hair caught the lamplight like spun gold, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over the stove. Each image burned itself into his memory, a bittersweet treasure to hoard against the lonely days to come. They sat down to eat, the simple fare before them as unappetizing as sawdust. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire, punctuated only by the clink of cutlery against plates. When they did speak, their words skittered across the surface of their true feelings, like stones across a frozen pond. "Looks like clear weather for your journey tomorrow," Ethan mumbled, his eyes fixed on his plate, unable to meet Mattie's gaze. Mattie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it should be. Nice." The word nice hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. They spoke of mundane things, the state of the barn roof, the price of feed at the store, the train schedule for the next day. Each topic was a feeble attempt to dam the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm them. The words felt like pebbles thrown against a rising tide. As the meal progressed, the weight of their impending separation pressed down on them like a physical force. Memories began to slip out, unbidden, like water through cupped hands. "Remember the church social last spring?" Mattie said suddenly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "When you danced with me and Mrs. Hale said we moved together like we'd been doing it all our lives?" Ethan's heart clenched at the memory, a bittersweet ache spreading through his chest. "I remember," he said softly. "I'd never felt so light on my feet before." The memory of Mattie in his arms, her laughter ringing out, felt both vivid and painfully distant. They traded more memories. Moonlit walks where the snow crunched beneath their feet like delicate crystal. Quiet evenings by the fire when a look could say more than words ever could. Each recollection was a bittersweet reminder of what they were about to lose, like pressing on a bruise to feel the pain anew. As they cleared the table for the last time, their hands brushed. The touch, brief as it was, sent a jolt through them both, like a spark in the darkness. Their eyes met, and for a moment, all the words they couldn't say hung in the air between them, as tangible as mist. The evening drew to a close, the shadows lengthening across the kitchen floor like grasping fingers. Neither Ethan nor Mattie made a move to leave, both acutely aware that saying goodnight would mark the beginning of the end. They stood there, frozen in a tableau of unspoken longing, as the old clock ticked away the last moments of their time together. As the final chime of the clock faded, Ethan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to speak, to act, to do something, anything, to stop the inexorable march of time. His heart raced, his palms grew damp, and just as he opened his mouth to break the silence, a loud crash from upstairs shattered the moment. Zeena's voice, shrill and demanding, called out Ethan's name. The spell broken, Ethan and Mattie exchanged one last, desperate look before reality came crashing back in. As Ethan turned to answer his wife's call, he knew sleep would not come easily tonight. Sleep eluded Ethan, leaving him trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts. Unable to find rest, he spent the night in a state of restless contemplation. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned around him, its timbers settling in the bitter cold of a Starkfield winter. Moonlight, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the frost-etched window, painting stark shadows across the worn floorboards. Ethan's calloused feet padded back and forth across his small bedroom, each step a muffled thud in the stillness of the night. The air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and desperation, a fitting perfume for a man caught between duty and desire. His mind raced, memories flashing before him like scenes from a Nickelodeon. There he was, a young man full of promise, hunched over engineering textbooks. The smell of fresh ink and possibility filled his nostrils, a stark contrast to the musty odor of regret that now clung to him. Those dreams, once as vast as the Massachusetts sky, now felt as distant as the stars twinkling coldly outside his window. Life, that cruel taskmaster, had other plans. Ethan's thoughts skittered like mice in the walls, scurrying from one painful memory to the next. His father's illness came first, a slow, inexorable descent that drained not just the old man's vitality, but the family's meager savings. Then his mother, once a pillar of strength, crumbled like a sandcastle before the relentless tide of grief and hardship. The farm, meant to be his legacy, became an anchor dragging him down into the depths of obligation. Each day was a struggle against the unyielding earth, his hands growing rougher as his hopes grew dimmer. And Zeena, her name tasted bitter on his tongue, like medicine gone bad. He'd married her out of loneliness, out of a desperate need for warmth in the cold emptiness of his life. Now her presence filled the house like a fog, seeping into every crack and crevice, suffocating any joy that dared to sprout. Ethan's heart quickened as his thoughts turned to Mattie. Sweet Mattie, with her laugh like summer rain and eyes that held all the warmth the world had denied him. In his mind's eye, he saw them running away together, leaving behind the prison of Starkfield. They could start anew, build a life filled with the love and laughter that had been so long absent from his world. For a moment, hope bloomed in his chest, as fragile and beautiful as the first crocus pushing through the snow. But reality, as cold and unforgiving as the wind that howled outside, quickly snuffed out that tender flame. His hands, rough and empty save for a few paltry coins, told the stark truth. The farm barely limped along, demanding every cent he could scrape together. The dream of escape crumbled like ash, leaving behind only the acrid taste of what might have been. As the night wore on, Ethan's conscience waged war with his heart. Duty, that unrelenting taskmaster, demanded he stay. The weight of generations of Fromes who'd worked this land pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit entirely. The God-fearing community of Starkfield loomed in his mind, their judgment as harsh as the winter wind. He could almost hear their whispers, sharp as icicles. "Did you hear about Ethan Frome? Ran off with his wife's cousin. Shameful." The Frome name, once spoken with respect, would be dragged through the mud like a carcass behind a cart. Could he bear that weight? Could he doom Mattie to a life of scorn and struggle? The eastern sky began to lighten, the first tentative rays of dawn creeping over the horizon like thieves. Ethan stood at the window, watching as the world slowly, reluctantly came to life. The bare trees stood like sentinels, their branches reaching toward a sky as gray and unforgiving as his future. His heart, full to bursting with love for Mattie, strained against the chains of duty and circumstance that bound him. Each beat was a cry of anguish, a plea for freedom that went unanswered. As the rooster crowed, its harsh call slicing through the morning stillness, Ethan's shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitability. He had to face the day, had to do what was expected of him. With leaden feet and a heart of stone, he began to prepare for the painful task ahead. Taking Mattie to the train station, watching as she disappeared from his life forever. But as he reached for his clothes, a wild, desperate thought seized him. What if he didn't? What if just this once he chose happiness over duty? His hand trembled on the doorknob as the first hints of a plan began to form in his mind. The morning of Mattie's departure loomed, cold and unforgiving. A gray sky pressed down on the Frome farm, as if the very heavens sought to crush his newfound resolve. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he made his decision. Would he have the courage to see it through? The morning of Mattie's departure arrived, cold and unforgiving. A gray sky loomed overhead, casting a somber mood over the Frome farm. Ethan moved like a man trapped in a nightmare, his body on autopilot as he hitched the horse to the sleigh. The crunch of snow beneath his feet echoed in the eerie stillness, each step a countdown to the moment he dreaded. His breath formed small, fleeting clouds in the frigid air, reminding him of the warmth he was about to lose. Inside the house, Mattie gathered her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate. The small trunk she packed seemed to mock the brevity of her stay, each item a bittersweet reminder of the life she was leaving behind. When she finally emerged, her face was pale but composed, a mask hiding the turmoil that matched Ethan's own. From the window, Zeena watched, her face as impassive as a winter-frozen pond. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, their weight pressing down on Ethan and Mattie as they prepared to leave. The silence between them was thick enough to cut with a knife, filled with words left unsaid and feelings too dangerous to acknowledge. As the sleigh set off, its runners slicing through the fresh snow with a soft hiss, an oppressive quiet fell between the two passengers. The horses' steady breathing and the gentle jingle of harness bells were the only sounds that dared to break the morning's hush. The familiar landscape, once a source of joy, now seemed to taunt them with memories of happier times. They passed the white steeple of the church, its spire reaching toward the leaden sky like an accusing finger. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles white with the strain of maintaining control. The bend in the road where they often paused to admire the view came and went, the once beautiful vista of snow-covered hills now bleak and unforgiving. The old oak tree loomed ahead, its bare branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, trying to snatch away their last moments together. Ethan's mind flashed to a summer storm, sheltering with Mattie beneath its leafy canopy, the air thick with the scent of rain and possibility. Now in the grip of winter, the tree stood as a silent sentinel to their parting, its stark silhouette a painful reminder of all they were losing. With each familiar sight, their grief intensified. Memories of laughter and whispered conversations hung in the air between them, as tangible as the frost on the horse's mane. Ethan's mind raced, desperately seeking words to bridge the growing chasm, but his throat constricted, choking back the emotions he dared not voice. Beside him, Mattie sat still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Was she, like him, trying to etch every detail into her memory? The curve of a hill, the silhouette of a barn against the sky. Each image became precious, a talisman against the uncertain future that loomed before them. As they neared the outskirts of town, the train station appeared on the horizon. Its stark outline against the winter sky was a cruel reminder of the finality of their situation. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, as if the very air was being squeezed from his lungs. This journey, once a source of joy and anticipation, had transformed into a painful countdown to their inevitable separation. The rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves seemed to echo the frantic beating of Ethan's heart. He stole glances at Mattie, drinking in the sight of her profile, the curve of her cheek, the wisp of hair that had escaped her hat. How many more moments like this would he have? The weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them, Mattie's rigid posture speaking volumes about the effort it took to maintain her composure. As the train station grew larger with each passing moment, Ethan felt a surge of panic rising within him. The world they had built together was about to shatter, and he was powerless to stop it. Just as they were about to round the final bend that would bring the station into full view, Ethan suddenly pulled on the reins, bringing the sleigh to an abrupt halt. Mattie turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps? Or fear of what he might say or do next. Ethan and Mattie made their way to the train station, their footsteps heavy with the burden of their impending separation. The full weight of their parting pressed down upon them, making each fleeting moment unbearably precious. The crisp winter air bit at their exposed skin, turning their cheeks and noses a rosy red. Snowflakes danced lazily around them, settling on their coats and eyelashes like delicate, frozen tears. The world around them seemed muffled, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of their farewell. Their hands brushed against each other as they walked, neither daring to grasp hold, yet both yearning for that final connection. The train whistle pierced the air, a mournful cry that echoed the ache in their hearts. It was as if time itself was conspiring against them, pushing them inexorably toward the moment of goodbye. Suddenly, as if struck by a bolt of lightning, they both halted mid-step. Ethan turned to Mattie, his eyes searching her face, drinking in every detail as if to etch it permanently in his memory. "I can't do it," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, barely audible above the howling wind. "I can't let you go." Mattie's eyes welled with tears, glistening like diamonds in the pale winter light. "Then don't," she replied, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. In that moment, a desperate plan formed in Ethan's mind. The hill they had once talked about coasting down loomed in the distance, a beacon of wild hope in their sea of despair. Without a word, he took Mattie's hand, her fingers icy in his grasp, and led her towards the horse and sleigh. As Ethan steered the horse up the hill, the world around them seemed to fade away. The bare trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, witnessing their ascent. The crunch of snow under the horse's hooves and the jingle of the sleigh bells were the only sounds that broke the heavy silence, a discordant melody to their unspoken desperation. At the summit, they paused. The long, steep slope stretched out before them, a blank canvas of pristine snow, ending at a large elm tree at the bottom. The tree stood stark against the white landscape, its bare branches reaching towards the gray sky like a hand grasping for salvation. Mattie's voice when she spoke was filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. "Ethan," she said, her eyes fixed on the elm tree, "what if we never got on that train? What if we just ended it all right here?" Ethan's heart raced, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. The idea should have horrified him, but instead it filled him with a perverse sense of relief. In that moment, all the pain and frustration of his life seemed to crystallize into this one act of defiance against fate. They positioned themselves on the sled, Mattie in front with Ethan behind her, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. Her body was warm against his, a stark contrast to the biting cold around them. He could feel her rapid breathing, matching the frantic beating of his own heart. The sled creaked beneath their combined weight, a final protest against the madness they were about to undertake. Time seemed to stand still as they teetered on the brink of their decision. The world around them faded to a blur of white and gray, the elm tree at the bottom of the hill the only point of focus. It loomed before them, both a target and a promise of release. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Mattie nodded, her body tensing against his. Her hair, escaped from her hat, tickled his face, carrying the faint scent of lavender that he had come to associate with her. With a mixture of terror and determination, they launched the sled down the hill. The wind whipped past them, stinging their faces and bringing tears to their eyes. The sled gathered speed, the world around them becoming a dizzying blur of motion. Snow sprayed up on either side of them, a white veil obscuring everything but their chosen path. The elm tree loomed larger with each passing second, their chosen instrument of destruction rapidly approaching. In these final moments, as the sled hurtled towards its target, Ethan and Mattie clung to each other, united in their desperate bid to control their destiny. The wind roared in their ears, drowning out everything but the pounding of their hearts. As they neared the bottom of the hill, time seemed to slow. The elm tree filled their vision, its rough bark and gnarled branches becoming clearer with each passing moment. Ethan tightened his grip on Mattie, bracing for impact. In that split second before collision, a single thought flashed through his mind. Was this really the answer? The sled rocketed toward the tree, unstoppable as an avalanche. Ethan closed his eyes, holding his breath. And then, the sound of splintering wood shattered the winter's quiet. The sled came to an abrupt, devastating stop against the ancient elm. Shock waves rippled through the snow-covered landscape, disturbing the peaceful silence that had moments ago enveloped Ethan and Mattie. Their bodies flew from the sled like leaves caught in a gust, landing with dull thuds in the deep, powdery snow. In the crash's wake, an eerie stillness fell. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds piercing the oppressive quiet were faint, pained groans. The stark white snow, once pristine, now bore dark streaks and hollows where they had landed. Ethan's mind swam in a sea of pain. Every twitch sent fresh waves of agony through his body, but he gritted his teeth and began to drag himself towards Mattie. The snow crunched beneath him, leaving a trail of disturbed white in his wake. When he reached her, Ethan found Mattie awake, but clearly in dire straits. Her face, usually rosy and full of life, was now as pale as the surrounding snow, etched with lines of shock and suffering. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the full weight of their failed suicide attempt crashed down upon them. A whirlwind of emotions swept over the pair. Relief at their continued existence mingled with a profound despair at the realization that their desperate plan had failed. The future they had sought to escape now loomed before them, more daunting and inescapable than ever. The jingling of approaching sleigh bells cut through their shared anguish. Help was coming, wanted or not. The first townspeople to arrive recoiled in horror at the sight. Gasps and murmurs of shock rippled through the growing crowd as word spread like wildfire through Starkfield. Soon a throng had gathered at the accident site. Neighbors who had barely spoken to the Fromes in years now stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their morbid curiosity and genuine concern. The air buzzed with speculation and whispered theories about what could have led to such a tragedy. With great care and difficulty, Ethan and Mattie were gently moved onto sleds. The procession back to the Frome farm was slow and solemn, each bump and jostle eliciting pain noises from the injured pair. As they moved through town, curtains twitched and doors opened, the entire population of Starkfield seemingly drawn to witness this latest chapter in the Frome saga. At the farm, the town doctor was hastily summoned. His arrival sparked a flurry of activity as he examined his patients. The doctor's face grew increasingly grave as he assessed their injuries. His initial prognosis fell like a hammer blow on those gathered. Both Ethan and Mattie had sustained serious injuries that would likely result in permanent disability. As the news spread, the Frome farm, once a place of quiet desperation and isolation, became the epicenter of Starkfield's attention. Neighbors who had long kept their distance now appeared at the door, arms laden with food and offers of assistance. The community, shocked into action by the accident's severity, rallied around the stricken family. Amidst this whirlwind of activity and concern, Zeena found herself thrust into an unexpected and ironic role. The woman who had for so long been defined by her own chronic complaints and need for care was now called upon to be the caretaker. As she moved between the bedsides of Ethan and Mattie, her face set in grim determination, one could almost see the weight of this new responsibility settling onto her shoulders. As night fell and the visitors slowly trickled away, a heavy silence descended upon the Frome household. Zeena sat between the two beds, her eyes darting from Ethan to Mattie and back again. The air was thick with unspoken words and the bitter tang of regret. In the dim light of the oil lamp, shadows danced across the walls, seeming to mock the stillness of the injured pair. Ethan, fighting against the fog of pain medication, caught Mattie's eye across the room. In that fleeting glance, a lifetime of what-ifs and might-have-beens passed between them. As exhaustion finally claimed them, pulling them into a fitful sleep, none could have imagined how this moment would echo through the years. The tragedy that unfolded on that snowy hillside would become the stuff of local legend, a cautionary tale whispered around firesides for generations to come. Little did they know that 20 years hence, their story would still captivate the imagination of Starkfield's residents, drawing in a curious outsider eager to unravel the mystery of the Frome family's ill-fated past. 20 years had passed since the tragic sledding accident that forever altered the lives of those involved. In the small town of Starkfield, whispers and sidelong glances still accompanied any mention of the Frome name, drawing a curious narrator into the enigmatic tale that lay hidden behind closed doors. The weight of unspoken sorrow hung in the crisp winter air as the narrator approached the old Frome farmhouse. His breath caught in his throat at the sight of the once proud homestead, now a weathered shell of its former self. Peeling paint clung desperately to warped clapboards, while the sagging roof seemed to bow under the weight of countless harsh New England winters. With each step up the creaking porch, the narrator's heart pounded louder in his ears. The door groaned open, a discordant welcome to a world frozen in time. The musty scent of neglect assaulted his senses as he crossed the threshold, his eyes straining to adjust to the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight, filtering through grimy windows, painting everything in shades of gray. And there, emerging from the shadows like a specter, stood Ethan Frome. The man before him was a far cry from the strapping young farmer of town legend. Ethan's once proud frame was permanently bent, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. Deep lines etched his face, each one a silent testament to years of regret and unspoken pain. The narrator's gaze was drawn to a figure in the corner, and his breath caught in his throat. Mattie, once described as vibrant and full of life, now lay twisted in a bed, her body a cruel reminder of that fateful night. Her voice, which had once been likened to birdsong, now grated on the ears, a constant querulous whine that set the narrator's teeth on edge. But it was Zeena who truly shocked him. The woman who had once been consumed by imaginary ailments now moved with grim efficiency. Her former hypochondria had vanished, replaced by a steely determination that both impressed and unnerved the narrator. She tended to Ethan and Mattie with mechanical precision, her face an unreadable mask. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of unspoken resentments and shattered dreams had taken physical form. Every gesture, every averted glance, spoke volumes about the shared history that bound these three souls together in a twisted knot of fate. Ethan's labored breathing filled the silence as he shuffled across the room, his cane tapping out a somber rhythm on the worn floorboards. The sound echoed through the house like the ticking of a monstrous clock, counting down the moments of their shared misery. Mattie's eyes followed him, a mixture of longing and bitterness clouding her once bright gaze. And Zeena, ever watchful, moved between them like a silent sentinel, her movements precise and economical. The irony of their situation hung heavy in the air, a bitter taste on the narrator's tongue. Ethan and Mattie, in their desperate bid for freedom and happiness, had instead condemned themselves to a lifetime of shared misery under Zeena's care. The very woman they had sought to escape had become their lifeline, their caretaker, their jailer. As the light began to fade outside, casting long shadows across the room, the narrator knew it was time to leave. He took one last look at the tableau before him, three lives forever intertwined by tragedy, playing out their roles in a macabre dance of duty and regret. Stepping back out into the cold, the narrator turned to face the Frome farm. In the gathering dusk, it stood like a monument to thwarted desires and the cruel twists of fate. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the old elm tree, seeming to echo with the ghosts of what might have been. With a heavy heart, the narrator began the long walk back to town. The Frome farm faded into the darkness behind him, but its story would linger long in his mind. It served as a somber reminder that sometimes the pursuit of happiness can lead down the darkest of paths, and that the consequences of our choices can echo through generations. As he walked, the narrator couldn't help but reflect on the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the tragedy that had befallen them, Ethan, Mattie, and Zeena continued on, bound together by circumstance and a shared history. Their story, though filled with sorrow, spoke to the enduring nature of the human heart, its capacity for both great love and great suffering. The lights of Starkfield began to twinkle in the distance, a beacon of normalcy after the haunting visit. The narrator knew that life in the town would go on, much as it always had, but now he carried with him the weight of the Frome's story, a tale of passion, sacrifice, and the unforeseen consequences of our deepest desires. As he reached the outskirts of town, the narrator made a silent vow. He would honor the Frome's story, ensuring that their struggle and their silent dignity would not be forgotten. For in their tragedy lay a universal truth about the human condition, the delicate balance between duty and desire, and the profound impact our choices can have on the lives of those around us. The chapter of Ethan Frome's life that the narrator had witnessed might have been drawing to a close, but its echoes would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Starkfield. It would serve as a poignant reminder of the complexities of love, the weight of obligation, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of life's cruelest twists of fate.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.